The dragon came down out of the blizzard, like something the mountain itself had thrown, a scream of tearing wind, and then an impact that shook snow loose from every tree on the ridge, and Elowen was out of her watchpost and running toward the wreckage before the sound had finished echoing off the rock face. She had lived on this border post for 6 years, long enough to know every kind of storm the mountain could produce, and she knew, the instant she saw the massive dark shape crumpled in the drift below her hut, that this was not weather. This was something dying. She reached him through snow that came past her knees, her lantern throwing wild shadows across scales the deep gray blue of a winter sky gone violent, and found a wing bent at an angle no wing should hold, the membrane torn in 3 places, blood already freezing black against the white ground beneath him. His great chest heaved in short, labored pulls, and one enormous eye tracked her approach with an exhausted, wary attention that held no strength left for fighting her off. "You are not going to die in my snow," Elowen told him, dropping to her knees beside the ruined wing without a single thought for her own safety, because 6 years of watching this border alone had taught her that hesitation killed faster than almost anything else the mountain offered. She stripped off her outer coat and packed it hard against the worst of the bleeding, and when that was not enough, when the cold radiating off his enormous body told her he would not survive the night exposed on open rock, she made the only decision that made any sense to her at all. I should say plainly that Elowen owned exactly 1 blanket worth calling warm, a thick wool weave her grandmother had made before she died, the only inheritance from a family that had otherwise left her nothing but a debt and a promise she had never wanted to keep. She pulled it from her own shoulders without a moment's hesitation and spread it over the dragon's heaving side, and stayed kneeling in the snow beside him through the worst hour of the storm, talking low and steady, refusing to let either of them freeze alone. The dragon's massive head turned toward her twice during that long, cold hour, amber eye tracking her face with an attention that felt, even through his obvious pain, deliberate rather than merely reflexive, and Elowen found herself talking to him the way she had once talked to the empty mountain air on her loneliest watches, filling the silence between them with whatever steadying nonsense came to mind. She did not know, kneeling there with her grandmother's blanket freezing stiff around his enormous frame, that the dragon beneath her hands was already memorizing the particular sound of her voice as something worth surviving the night for. Elowen was 25. The last of a border family that had watched this stretch of mountain pass for 3 generations, and she had inherited the post along with a debt her father had left unpaid when a bad winter took both her parents within a season of each other. The debt belonged, now, to a merchant family 2 valleys south, and the arrangement that settled it required Elowen to marry their eldest son, Osric, a transaction dressed up in wedding clothes that everyone in the valley understood for exactly what it was. The ceremony was 3 weeks away. She had stopped letting herself feel much of anything about it months ago, filing the marriage away with the rest of her duties, another season of watching the pass, another obligation to be met without complaint. She dragged the wounded dragon toward her stone barn, through the worst of the night, using a sledge meant for hauling winter feed, her arms and back screaming with the effort, long before she finally got him settled against the barn's thickest wall. The barn was not built to shelter something his size comfortably, but it held out the worst of the wind, and Elowen spent what remained of the night packing his wounds with every herb her small stores contained, working by lantern light, while the storm outside grew from bad to something the valley would talk about for years. She had never been afraid of dragons the way most of the lowland villagers were, having grown up watching them cross the high passes at altitude on their way to territories she would never see, distant and magnificent and entirely separate from her own small, dutiful life. This one felt different. Kneeling this close to him, close enough to feel his ragged breath stir the loose hair at her temple, close enough to watch the exhausted gratitude move through his one visible eye each time her hands found a wound and eased it. "I don't know what brought you down out of that sky," she murmured to him near dawn, her voice hoarse with exhaustion, "but you picked a strange place to fall. I don't have much to offer you besides a barn and a blanket, and I'm afraid both of those already belonged to someone else's plans before tonight." She thought of Osric then, briefly, the way she had trained herself to think of him only briefly. a practical arrangement she had agreed to, the way she agreed to every hard necessity the mountain handed her. There had never been unkindness in it, only a total absence of anything resembling the choice she was watching herself make now, kneeling in a cold barn tending a stranger's dragon, simply because the alternative was letting something magnificent die in her snow. She pushed the comparison away before it could settle into something she did not have room to examine, and turned her attention back to the wounded wings still needing her care. The knock came at first light, 3 days into a storm that had only worsened, and Elowen opened her door to find a man collapsed against the frame, half frozen and barely conscious, snow crusted thick in dark hair, and a travel pack still clutched in one stiff hand. She hauled him inside with the same unhesitating practicality she had shown the dragon, stripping off frozen outer layers and packing him near her small fire, and it was another hour before he came around enough to speak in more than broken fragments. "Talon," he managed, the word cracking out of him the moment his eyes found the barn through her small window, urgency cutting through the fog of exposure. "My dragon, is he?" He tried to rise and failed, his body too depleted from exposure to obey him, and Elowen pressed him firmly back down with a hand against his chest. "Your dragon is alive, packed in wool and comfrey in my barn, and considerably better off than you are right now," she told him, and watched some enormous tension drain visibly out of his shoulders at the news. He introduced himself as Garreth, a trapper working the high passes, caught out in the storm when Talon went down during a routine survey flight, and Elowen accepted the story with the particular patience of a woman who had learned, from 6 years alone on this border, not to press strangers for more truth than they offered freely. She noticed things anyway, the quality of his boots too fine for a trapper's wage, the careful, deliberate way he asked about the storm's likely duration, as though the answer mattered to something larger than his own survival, the map fragment that fell from his pack, that showed markings no simple hunter would bother tracking. She filed each detail away without comment, the same way she filed away most things in her careful, watchful life, and busied herself instead with the practical work of keeping 2 exhausted strangers, one human and one enormous, alive through a storm that showed no sign of breaking. "Thank you," Garreth said quietly, watching her work by the fire's low light, something raw and unguarded moving behind his exhausted eyes. "For both of us. I do not know many people who would have done what you did tonight for a dragon they had never met." Elowen shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude she had not been doing this to earn. "He was dying in my snow," she said simply. "I was not going to let that happen if I could help it." Garreth watched her return to her work with an expression she could not quite name, something between disbelief and a quiet, growing wonder, and did not press her further that first night, though she noticed him studying her more than the fire's ordinary warmth would explain. She busied herself checking Talon's dressings one final time before allowing herself to rest, aware, in some part of her mind she was not yet ready to examine closely, that both the dragon and the stranger sheltering under her roof had already begun to matter to her in ways her careful, dutiful life had never quite made room for before. The storm did not break for 4 more days, burying the mountain pass under snow deep enough to make any attempt at travel a death sentence, and Elowen found herself sharing her small watchpost with a man whose careful half-truths she noticed more each day, and a dragon who grew stronger and more alert with every hour of her patient care. Garreth insisted on helping despite his own lingering weakness, hauling feed and water for Talon with a determination that told her plainly how much the dragon meant to him, and the 2 of them settled into a rhythm of shared, unspoken labor that felt, increasingly, less like strangers thrown together by chance. She learned, in fragments offered over shared meals and long evenings by the fire, that Garreth read maps the way other men read familiar books, that he carried himself with a quiet authority that did not match his claimed trade, and that he watched her with an attention that made her heart do something complicated and unfamiliar every time she caught him at it. She told herself it meant nothing, that a woman 3 weeks from an arranged marriage had no business noticing the particular warmth in a stranger's eyes, and found the reminder growing less convincing with every day the storm kept them close. "You are getting married," Garreth said on the 3rd night, not quite a question, watching her mend a torn glove by firelight with careful, unhurried hands. Elowen's fingers stilled on the needle. "In 3 weeks," she confirmed, keeping her voice level with an effort that cost her more than she wanted to admit. "It settles a debt my father left behind. It is not a story with much romance in it, if that's what you're asking." Garreth was quiet for a long moment, watching the fire rather than her face, something working behind his expression that she could not fully read. "I have spent most of my life," he said finally, low, "surrounded by people who wanted things from me, for reasons that had nothing to do with who I actually was, underneath the wanting. I did not expect to find that same weight sitting on the shoulders of a woman living alone on a mountain pass." Elowen looked up at him then, startled by the honesty of it, and found something in his gaze that made the small room feel considerably warmer than the fire alone could explain. Talon made a low, knowing sound from his corner of the barn just then, visible even through the wall separating them, and Garreth laughed softly, breaking the charged stillness between them with an ease that told Elowen this was not the first time his dragon had offered an opinion on matters Garreth would rather have kept private. "He does that," Garreth admitted, something warm and rueful in his voice. "Talon has never had much patience for watching me talk around a feeling, instead of simply naming it." Elowen found herself smiling, despite the ache still tangled up in her chest, grateful for the dragon's timely interruption, even as some reckless part of her wished it had waited a moment longer. The worst of the storm arrived on the 5th night, wind screaming hard enough to strip shingles from the barn roof and send Talon into a low, distressed rumble that Elowen felt through the stone floor before she heard it, and she was out of bed and across the yard with Garreth close behind her before either of them had stopped to grab a proper coat against the cold. They found the barn roof sagging dangerously under the accumulated weight of snow, groaning with a sound that promised imminent collapse directly over the corner where Talon lay, still too weak to move himself clear. "We have to shift him," Elowen shouted over the wind, already working the sledge ropes with hands gone numb from cold, and Garreth joined her without hesitation, both of them straining together against Talon's considerable weight, while the roof above them creaked louder with every passing second. They dragged him clear with perhaps 30 seconds to spare, before the whole corner gave way in an avalanche of splintered wood and snow, and Elowen found herself thrown backward by the collapse, landing hard against Gareth's chest, as he caught her instinctively, both of them breathing hard in the sudden ringing silence that followed. Neither of them moved away immediately. Elowen felt Gareth's heart hammering beneath her palm, where it had landed against his chest, felt his arms tighten around her, not from any urgency the danger still demanded, but from something else entirely, something neither of them had let themselves name through 5 careful days of shared, unspoken closeness. "I thought," he said, low and unsteady against her hair, "for one very bad second, that I was about to lose both of you in the same night." Elowen pulled back just far enough to look up at him, snow still swirling around them both in the ruined barn's opening, and felt something in her chest crack open that she had spent months, maybe years, keeping carefully sealed. "I am not accustomed to anyone worrying about losing me," she admitted, breathless, and Gareth's hand came up to cradle her frozen cheek with a gentleness that stole whatever careful distance either of them had left to hide behind. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the ruined barn creaking around them and the storm still howling beyond its broken corner, and Elowen let herself simply exist inside the warmth of his hand against her cold skin, without reaching for any of the careful explanations she usually kept ready for, moments that threatened to matter too much. She had spent months teaching herself not to want things she could not have. Standing in the wreckage of that collapsed roof, she found she had very little discipline left for that particular lesson. The near kiss that followed broke apart before it finished, both of them pulling back with the sudden, mutual awareness of a dragon watching them from 3 feet away, with unmistakable amusement in his one good eye, and Elowen laughed, despite the cold and the wreckage, and the fear still hammering through her chest, the sound startled out of her by the sheer absurdity of the moment. Garreth laughed too, low and relieved, and helped her rebuild a rough shelter for Talon against the barn's remaining wall, before either of them addressed what had very nearly happened between them. It was Talon, in the end, who forced the fuller truth into the open, nudging Gareth's shoulder with unmistakable insistence once the immediate crisis had passed, and Garreth sighed, the particular sigh of a man who had run out of room to keep hiding. "The map fragment you found," he said quietly, once they were settled back near the fire, exhaustion and adrenaline finally catching up with them both. "It was not for hunting trails. I was scouting this border for signs of a raiding group that has been moving weapons through unmapped mountain passes for months, and Talon was struck by an arrow mid-flight 3 days before we went down in your snow." Garreth shook his head, with a steadiness that surprised even herself, the shape of a dozen small, careful lies, finally resolving into something that made sense. "You are not a trapper," she said, not quite a question. Garreth shook his head, watching her carefully for her reaction. "No," he admitted. "I am considerably more than that, and I have not yet found the right moment to tell you exactly how much more, because I did not want the truth to change how you looked at me before I had earned the right to hope it might not." "Try me," Elowen said, quiet and steady, and Garreth studied her for a long moment before he finally, slowly, began to explain exactly who he actually was. He told her of the smuggling reports that had reached him months earlier, vague at first and then increasingly specific, weapons moving through passes no official survey had ever properly mapped, and of his decision to investigate personally rather than trust the matter to advisors who might already be compromised by the very corruption he was trying to root out. Elowen listened without interrupting, piecing together a picture of a man who carried far more weight on his shoulders than the plain traveler's coat had ever suggested, and found her earlier caution toward him settling into something closer to quiet, reluctant admiration. The revelation came in careful pieces, Gareth's true rank and purpose settling over Elowen with a weight she was still absorbing when the sound of horses reached the watchpost 2 days later, a search party sent up from the valley the moment the storm broke enough to make travel survivable, led by Osric himself and a half-dozen men from his family's household. Elowen met them at the edge of the yard with her heart hammering, acutely aware of Garreth standing near the barn behind her, and the enormous dragon he had not yet found a way to explain to a search party, expecting nothing more dramatic than a missing shepherd. "We feared you dead in the storm," Osric said, relief, and something colder moving across his face, as his gaze traveled past Elowen, to the stranger, and the dragon behind her. "Who is this?" Elowen felt the whole fragile structure of the last week threaten to collapse under the weight of a question she was not yet ready to answer honestly, and found herself grateful, in that suspended moment, for Gareth's calm, practiced authority as he stepped forward to meet Osric's suspicion directly. "A traveler your betrothed's courage saved from freezing to death in her own barn," Garreth said, giving nothing away of his true identity, though something in his tone made clear he would not tolerate whatever accusation Osric's expression was building toward. Osric's eyes narrowed, moving between them with open distrust, and Elowen understood, watching the exchange, that whatever peace the storm had built between her and Garreth was about to be tested by a world neither snow nor distance had managed to keep out for very much longer. "The wedding is in 11 days, Osric said, pointed and cold, addressing Elowen directly now. "I trust nothing about this storm has changed your understanding of the arrangement." Elowen felt Garreth go very still beside her, waiting, giving her the space to answer for herself, rather than speaking over her, and she found, searching for a response, that the easy resignation she had carried toward her own marriage for months had quietly, irreversibly, stopped feeling like acceptance at all. "The storm changed a great many things this week," she said finally, choosing each word with deliberate care, watching Osric's expression harden further with every syllable. "I am not certain yet what all of them mean, but I am no longer certain the arrangement we made months ago still fits the woman standing in front of you now." Osric's jaw tightened, and he turned his search party back toward the valley without further argument, though the look he left her with promised this conversation was far from finished. Garreth exhaled slowly once the riders had gone, some of the tension leaving his shoulders, though the danger the search party's visit represented had not actually passed at all. The attack came that same night, before Elowen had found the words to answer Osric honestly, 6 armed riders emerging from the tree line with the coordinated precision of men who had tracked Gareth's trail through the thinning snow with deliberate purpose. Elowen woke to shouting and the clash of steel, and was out of bed and reaching for the hunting knife she kept beside her door before she had fully processed what was happening, finding Garreth already fighting 2 attackers at once in the yard, while Talon, healed enough now to move but not yet strong enough to fly, held the barn entrance against a third with furious, protective violence. She threw herself into the fight without hesitation, years of border post survival lending her hands a steadiness that surprised the raider who turned on her, and fought beside Garreth with a fierce, desperate coordination that spoke of something deeper than the week's careful closeness had yet found words for. Talon's roar split the night as he caught one attacker in his jaws and flung him bodily into a snowbank, and between the 3 of them, Dragon and Scout and Shepherd fighting as a single unit, the raiding party broke and fled into the tree line within minutes, leaving one of their own captured and bound in the trampled snow. Garreth turned to Elowen the moment the danger passed, checking her over with hands that shook from more than the cold, finding a shallow cut along her forearm that she had not even registered receiving in the chaos. "You should not have thrown yourself into that," he said, low and rough with fear that had nowhere else to go now that the fight was over. "You could have died protecting a truth you did not even fully know yet." "I was not protecting a truth," Elowen told him, breathless, gripping his hand hard enough to anchor them both. "I was protecting you, Garreth, whatever else you turn out to actually be underneath everything you have not told me yet. I decided that the moment I saw you fighting for your dragon's life, and I am not taking the decision back now." They tended their scattered wounds together in the aftermath, Elowen's shallow cut and the various bruises Garreth had earned defending the barn, working in a shared, exhausted silence that said more than either of them had words left for that night. Talon settled close around them both once the immediate danger passed, wings loosely draped over the 2 humans he had watched fight for his life and for each other in the same breathless hour, and Elowen found herself leaning into the dragon's warmth without hesitation, grateful beyond words for the strange, impossible family the storm had assembled on her mountain. The captured raider, questioned at dawn by a Garreth whose careful command of the interrogation left no more room for Elowen to doubt exactly how much authority he actually carried, confirmed what the map fragment had already suggested, a weapons smuggling operation moving through the unmapped passes with the quiet cooperation of officials Garreth had been sent, personally, to expose. Elowen listened to the whole account with a steadiness that had stopped surprising either of them, and when the raider was finally led away toward the valley for proper judgment, Garreth turned to her with the last of his careful secrecy, visibly, deliberately, falling away. "My name is Garreth," he said, "and I am not a scout in service to the crown. I am the crown. I have been emperor of this territory for 4 years, and I came into these mountains disguised because an emperor asking open questions about smuggling routes gets lied to, while a trapper asking the same questions sometimes gets the truth instead." Elowen absorbed the revelation in silence, matching it against a week of small, unexplained details that suddenly, entirely, made sense. "You let me bandage an emperor's dragon in my barn," she said finally, something between disbelief and reluctant laughter in her voice. "And you let me hand you my last blanket without telling me any of this." Gareth's mouth curved, warm despite the exhaustion still etched into his face. "You did not offer either of those things to an emperor," he said quietly. "You offered them to a stranger and a dying dragon, without knowing or caring what either of us might be able to give you in return. I have spent 4 years surrounded by people who calculate exactly what kindness might earn them. I do not think I have ever been offered kindness with nothing attached to it at all, until this week. I have read a line from the poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning, asking how she loves him, and answering that she will count the ways, and I think of Elowen in that ruined barn, counting nothing at all when she gave a dying stranger her only blanket, offering everything she had without once pausing to calculate the cost of it. Garreth stayed 2 more days at the watchpost before the pass cleared enough for proper travel, and in those 2 days he told her everything he had not yet found room to say. The loneliness of a throne surrounded by careful calculation, the particular relief of a week spent being valued for nothing more than his own two capable hands. Elowen listened to all of it with the same unhurried patience she brought to every wound she had ever tended, understanding, by the second evening, that she was not simply falling for an emperor's title. She was falling for the plain, exhausted, grateful man underneath it, the one no court in the valley below had ever bothered to actually meet. Garreth rode down into the valley himself 2 days later, once Talon's strength had returned enough to fly short distances, and settled Elowen's family debt with the merchant house directly, paying it in full from his own purse, and releasing her from an arrangement that had never once asked what she actually wanted from her own life. Osric's family accepted the settlement with the particular speed of people who had only ever wanted the debt resolved, and the wedding that had loomed over Elowen for months simply dissolved into paperwork and formal apology, as though it had never carried the weight she had spent a whole winter resigning herself to. "You did not have to do that," Elowen told him, standing in the same watchpost yard where a dragon had fallen out of the sky and changed the whole shape of her careful, dutiful life, though the words came out closer to overwhelmed gratitude than protest. Garreth took both her hands in his, steady and certain, in a way 4 years of rule had taught him to be about very little else besides this. "I did not do it as a debt settled for a favor received," he said. "I did it because I could not stand the thought of a life you never chose, swallowing up the only person who has ever given me something without expecting anything back." "What do you want instead?" Elowen asked, breathless, though some part of her had already guessed the answer written plainly across his face. Garreth drew her closer, resting his forehead against hers, the way he had that first ruined night in the collapsing barn, and let 4 years of careful royal composure fall away entirely, for the length of his answer. "I want to spend the rest of my life earning the kind of kindness you gave me before you ever knew who I was," he said, low and unguarded. "I want you to come down from this mountain, not as a debt paid off, but as the woman I love, freely, the same way you loved a dying dragon before you had a single reason to." Talon curled around them both as Elowen said yes. The storm long since passed, and Elowen thought, standing in the ordinary yard that had somehow become the center of an entirely new life, that some debts were never really debts at all, only love, that had not yet found its proper name.